Welcome to class. Thought I'd introduce you to my cats. This is Annie, and the orange one who's not on the screen is Rocket. They have been very interested in what has been going on in this room because I don't let them in while I'm recording, so I thought I'd let them say hi. So today's lecture is covering chapter 21 on evidence of evolution, and this week's mini exam is going to include chapter 21 and chapter 20. We'll go over chapter 20 on Thursday. So there are quite a few objectives for this chapter, but they're really not that difficult to comprehend. So the first is talking about natural selection and what 3 rules must be fulfilled for natural selection to occur. You should be able to, in an example, identify whether or not those 3 rules have been met. Second, you should be able to compare and contrast natural and artificial selection. Third, you should be able to demonstrate, be able to understand how fossils can demonstrate the existence of intermediate species. And also four, that evolution has a branched, not a chain-like trend. And we'll look at an example in the evolution of horses. Then we'll talk about some evidence for evolution, including homologous structures, embryonic development, and imperfect structures. And you should be able to understand why each of those things provide support for the evolution. And then lastly, you're going to learn about something called convergent evolution and understand how it is that 2 different species can evolve separate sides of a continent, yet still end up looking quite similar. So first objective, let's talk about the 3 rules of natural selection. Natural selection is the main process by which evolution occurs. Now, we cannot travel back in time to observe evolution in action, but we can observe natural selection in the lab or out in the field. Now, first of all, what the heck is natural selection, right? What I'd like you to do is pause the video and Google or look in your textbook for 3 different definitions of natural selection. So take a minute to do that now. I've done the same thing. The questions, there's going to be questions on a little quiz. That's basically my version of an in-class activity for this lecture. So this is going to be one of the questions. You should look up 3 different definitions, and they cannot all be the same as the ones I have on the slide. You can use one of my definitions. So first definition I found was differential reproduction of genotypes caused by factors in the environment that lead to evolutionary change, right? So differential or different reproduction of genotypes caused by the environment leading to change. The next definition I found was pretty short: the process by which species adapt to their environment. And then my longest definition I found: natural selection is a natural process that results in the survival and reproductive fitness of individuals or groups that are best adjusted for their environment. And this leads to the perpetuation of genetic qualities best suited for that environment. The reason why I want you to look up 3 different definitions is so that you can come up with your own best understanding of what natural selection actually means. Let's look at an example of natural selection using Darwin's finches. So Darwin went out to the Galapagos Islands, and at the time he was not an expert specifically on bird species. He visited 3 different islands, collected about 31 specimens, brought them back to England, and had someone help him identify these different birds. And he found out, once he had colleagues look at these different birds, that they were in fact representing several different species. So he thought, well, they look all pretty similar to me. But in fact, there were several distinct species in his collection. And the main unique thing that differentiated these species was their beak shape. Here we can see some examples of different beak shapes in Galapagos finches. So we have some that are really thick and short and stubby. We have others that are more narrow, some that have a bit of a curve. Right? So these are all different species of Galapagos finches. And the idea that Darwin had was that they have these different beak shapes in order to eat different types of food, and that maybe over time they had evolved to best fit the environment that they were in and to eat the resources that were most accessible. So if you remember, we talked about Darwin's finches before in the context of adaptive radiation. So this is an idea that you have these islands that a species, an ancestral species, can disperse among, and these are rather uninhabited islands. They're formed by volcanoes, so they can come up pretty new, and there's no other competing species there. And over time, at each individual island, they evolve whatever traits are best suited to get resources in that and to survive in that environment. And so because they are geographically isolated, they are not going to be mating amongst each other, and so over time they're going to become more and more distinct. Okay. So again, we can see this example. We've got ground and cactus finches, tree finches, vegetarian tree finches, and warbler finches. And these different families, or these have different characteristics. So some of them have more smaller, narrow beaks. Some of them maybe are a bit bigger, right? Depending on the type of food and where that they're eating and where they're being found. So then once they had that initial differentiation geographically on these different islands, then over time within a specific island, there was the opportunity for um, sympatric speciation to occur, right? So you've got these birds and they're all competing on the same island for a shared resource. Right? So this is when you could have resource partitioning come into play, and that some of the birds in that population on that island are going to, for example, feed on seeds. Others are going to adjust and feed on insects or buds on branches, and that they're able to do this because of a process called character displacement. Right? Natural selection is, is enhancing those traits that allow them to use resources differently, and they also are going to look differently as a result, different as a result. So again, natural selection, differential reproduction of genotypes caused by factors in the environment that lead to evolutionary change. So let's break this down a bit, right? Differential reproduction of genotypes. You've got a variety of genotypes, a variety of genes, different characteristics that that population has, right? And some of those characteristics are being passed down, reproduced in the next generation, and others aren't. So some are better and some are worse, depending upon what environment they are on, right? Caused by factors in the environment. And lastly, that leads to evolutionary change. So these different traits, some of them are so good that they are going to eventually lead to a change evolutionarily in that species. So there are three main rules or conditions for natural selection to occur, and it's important that you know these. So first, variation must be present, right? So if you're going to be having evolution of beak size, that means that in that original ancestral population, there had to be some birds that had bigger beaks and some that had smaller beaks, right? Next, there has to be a benefit or disadvantage of that trait, right? So if it didn't matter whether your beak was big or small for survival, that wouldn't be it wouldn't be chosen for, it wouldn't evolve, right? So that variability must give some individuals an advantage or a disadvantage in terms of reproduction. So could come up with a silly example, right? We all have different ability to play the guitar, right? And maybe for some reason in the future, being able to play the guitar well is going to be really critical for attracting a mate. And so over time, that trait is going to be enhanced in humans, right? So that leads us to our third rule or condition. This variability must be genetically transmissible. So that ability to play the guitar or that beak size has to have a genetic foundation, right? There has to be a gene or set of genes responsible for that trait that can actually be passed down in egg and sperm. So if we all just learn to play really well, learning how to play guitar, that doesn't get passed down. But maybe people that had an innate musical ability, those genes would get passed down. So let's look at an example of natural selection using these Galapagos finches and try to see if we can find the three conditions of natural selection present. Rosemary and Peter Grant studied one of the islands, Daphne Major, and looked at the medium ground finch population. And they found, first of all, that just in their first year, when they measured beak sizes in this population on this one island, that there was variability, right? So some had slightly bigger beaks, some had slightly smaller beaks, right? The next thing that they found was that year to year, the average beak depth, so the most commonly seen beak size, changed, right? And they saw there was a pattern in how this was changing. So after a drought period, they found that the next generation of birds had bigger, deeper, more powerful beaks. But after a normal rainy season, they found just the basic original size of beak. And what they were able to find out is that birds with these bigger beaks are able to eat larger seeds. And so when there's a drought, a lot of those smaller seeds aren't going to be present or they're going to get eaten up. And the larger seeds, normally these birds can't eat them. But if there's a small population of birds with a larger beak, they can eat these larger seeds. Now they have an advantage, right? They can have more energy for reproducing, for mating, for caring for young. So what do we see? Rule 1, the condition is that there has to be phenotypic variability. It's not like every single bird on that island had the exact same beak size, right? There was some that had a little bit larger, some that were average, and some that were on the smaller side. Second condition was that that trait has to provide some type of advantage or disadvantage, right? It has to have an impact on survivability or ability to reproduce. And they do see that when there has been a drought, that if birds have a bigger beak, they're more likely to survive because they can eat bigger seeds that other birds in their population cannot. So we found 2 of the conditions so far, right? So let's talk about our third condition, that the trait has to have a genetic component, right? So let's look at some raw data that they provide. On the left, we have the y-axis is the shape of the beak. So the more pointed a beak is, the more deep that beak is versus blunt, right? So pointed, blunt, right? And then on the x-axis, we have kind of the wet and dry years over time. And the trend that we see is that during and after dry years, the depth or the pointedness of these beaks tends to go up. And then during and after, or during the wet seasons, the beak size tends to be more blunt. All right, so when there's been lots of water, there's lots of seeds, lots of food for everybody, right? But when it's been dry, there's fewer seeds. And so if you can eat bigger seeds, you're going to be getting more energy. You have an advantage in terms of survivability and ability to reproduce. So is this trait actually inherited from one generation to the next? Let's look at figure B. We have beak depth of offspring on the y-axis and mean depth of parents on the x-axis. And you can see that as the parents' beaks become deeper, as you go to the right, you find that the size of their offspring's beaks also becomes similar. It also ends up to be bigger, right? So there's some type of gene or set of genes that are responsible for beak size, depth, and that is getting passed down from parents to offspring. So now that figure on the right is demonstrating our third condition being met. Let's look at another example. Here we have peppered moths. So these moths have a range of colors or shades of gray, dark gray, black, and white. And depending on the environment, it appears that certain shades can be more beneficial than others. Right? So natural selection, we've talked about in our definition, those traits, the reason why some are beneficial and some are not, just it all depends on the environment, right? So if your environment changes, the traits that are beneficial may also change. And that's what we're going to look at in the peppered moths. So there is a single gene that regulates body color in the peppered moth. And most of the time, up until the 1850s, recordings of data shows that most of them were lighter in color, right? So Black individuals were not seen very frequently. But starting at about that time, the body colors became darker and darker. Right? And they noticed that this was happening near industrial areas. So the scientist J.W. Tutt proposed that maybe the light-colored moths, that trait was not advantageous, right? It was being selected against. And here we have a picture of a dark and a light moth, right? And when the bark is covered in soot on the right, you can see that the light-colored moth sticks out really obviously, right? So he thought that perhaps these moths are getting preyed upon by birds, and if they don't match these polluted, sooty trees, they're sticking out, and they're getting eaten, and their genes are not getting passed on. Therefore, any of these moths that have the darker genes have an advantage, and that trait's getting passed on. And he did find that in more polluted areas, the number of light-colored moths decreased. So this phenomena that he found has been called industrial melanism. So melanin, pigment, industry, pollution, right? This idea that in polluted areas, darker individuals will become more common. Over time, especially in the US, the levels of pollution have been improved, have been reduced, and so trees tend to be less polluted and dirty, and they become lighter. And what they found was that similarly, the population of peppered moths also began to become lighter in color. So you can see as the environment is changing, so is the selective pressure, right? Whatever trait is most beneficial at one time may not necessarily be beneficial in the future if the environment changes. And here's some data that is actually evidence for this. So we have on the left percentage of melanic moths, so dark moths, over time. Starting in 1959, going up till 2003. And the idea is that over time, we have better regulations against air pollution, and you can find that the number of dark moths has been decreasing in Great Britain, in Detroit, and in Pennsylvania. In Great Britain, the Clean Air Act came out in 1956, so right before this data started to be collected, and in 1963 in Detroit. So even though there is a very obvious connection between levels of pollution, the colors of these trees, and the colors of the moths, more research has been done on this topic and has been shown, and it has been shown that it is not necessarily, the agent causing this change is not necessarily predation. So they've tried doing experiments with predators, looking to see, do the light colored moths could eat more than the dark and things like that, and they haven't been able to prove that. So there is still a connection. For some reason, in polluted areas, having a darker color is beneficial, but the reason why is not quite yet known. And this really is a good demonstration of the scientific method, right? We are constantly coming up with all these different hypotheses and trying to prove many of them wrong until we can only find one that makes sense. So here is another question. I know it says question 1, but this will be question 2 on your quiz, right? So how does the example of the peppered moths fulfill the 3 rules of natural selection? So we've got what? Phenotypic variability must be present. Second, the variability has to confer some type of advantage. And third, that trait, that phenotype has to have a genetic basis that can be transmitted to offspring. So I'm just repeating our slides from earlier, right? Do we see anything in here about variability? Right? Yes, here it says adult moth, Beestone betularia, come in a variety of shades. Do we see anything about a trait, this shade color, having a selective advantage in any way? I would say more on the second slide. We'll get to that. But we do see for our third rule that the trait has to have a genetic component. On this slide, we have it is known that what the gene is that controls that black color. All right, so we've got rule 1 and rule 3 have been demonstrated on this slide. And then for rule 2, the evidence that this trait is providing some type of advantage or a disadvantage. This is when he went out and collected numbers and he found that with pollution, the number of light-colored moths dropped and the number of dark-colored moths increased. Let's move on to our second objective, talking about natural and artificial selection. So you've probably heard of artificial selection before. This is the idea that humans are controlling the traits of an animal and selecting which ones get passed on onto offspring. And so this is a lot like natural selection, but instead of the environment choosing what is beneficial, we are choosing what is beneficial. And this can be seen in an example in fruit flies, in which scientists had an initial population with a certain number of bristles, these hairs on the body of the flies. And they said, let's see if this is a trait that we can select for. So they took their initial population that had an average number of about 40 bristles on the abdomen, and they split them into 2 populations. So they took their flies, split them into 2 groups. One group that had a lower number of bristles and one group that had a higher number of bristles. And they didn't let them interbreed, all right? So the low-numbered bristled flies only got to mate with each other, and the high number of bristled flies got to only mate with each other. And 86 generations later, which is not that long in fly world, they found that the average number of bristles had changed in these 2 populations. So over time, the average number of bristles in the low population became about 10, and they were able to get over 80 bristles in the high population on average. Right? Another example that we've seen is in the evolution of corn or maize. Right? So originally this teosinte plant had only 1 row of kernels, and they probably weren't very tasty. It doesn't look very yummy to me. But people over time would select corn plants that had more kernels on them and that were tastier and larger in size. And so now the majority of the corn that you see looks quite different than the original species. Another example could be in cows, selecting for cows that can breed, or selecting for cows that can produce a lot of milk. Obviously, pets is a very common example of artificial selection. So pigeons have been trained to fly fast and long distances. Dogs have been selected for certain traits such as being friendly or protective for having herding abilities. And so you can see in this example, the original ancestral wolf, we have different breeds ranging from Chihuahua to Mastiff. And something kind of interesting about artificial selection is that sometimes when we choose for one trait that we find desirable, some other traits get passed on as well. Right? This is called pleiotropy or linkage. You don't need to understand right now the mechanism behind that, but let's look at an example. So these scientists attempted to domesticate silver foxes. So try to see if over time they could breed silver foxes to be like dogs, to be very friendly and to like humans. They're pretty cute looking, right? Well, that is because within 40 years, in addition to successfully selecting these calm, friendly traits, they also got some of the traits of dogs. So the face shape changed a little bit and the ears so that they began to look more like dogs. So for some reason, the genes that are responsible for animal behavior, such as being docile, are also, in addition to those being selected for, along with them come some of these visible morphometric features. You might actually, let's talk about one other example. So maybe some of you out there have pugs. So pugs, they've got those cute squished faces, right? But if you have pugs, you probably know that there are some other traits that aren't so beneficial, such as having trouble breathing and also hip dysplasia, right? And so that is another example of these unintentional traits that are unintentionally passed down during artificial selection. So another question that will be on your quiz this week is to compare and contrast natural and artificial selection in terms of the 3 rules. Right? So first, phenotypic variation must exist in the population. Would that be the same or not in artificial versus natural selection? Second, this variation must lead to differences among individuals in lifetime reproductive success. So is there a variation in some type of trait that is giving an advantage to some species being able to reproduce than others? And how is that happening? Right? And then third, natural versus artificial selection. The variability in phenotype, that appearance or behavior or function, has to have a genetic component. It has to be transmitted to offspring, right? So I'm not going to give you the answer to those, but you can think about those and write up your thoughts on the quiz. So can artificial or natural selection produce major evolutionary changes? So a lot of the examples that we've looked at are pretty minor examples of natural selection, right? Slight differences in beak size or in color of moth populations. And so it's easy to agree that yes, natural selection can promote some changes within a species, but dramatic changes from leading to a new species that look very different is harder to believe, right? And so one thing that I'd like to point out is talking about this artificial selection and what we found from artificial selection, right? So there is actually quite an extensive amount of change that we have been able to do quite rapidly with artificial selection. That hints that natural selection could also promote large changes via evolution. For example, we've talked about these dog species. We have got such a wide variety of dog breeds, right? From Chihuahuas to Greyhounds, St. Bernards, right? They look very, very different. Now, if you look at another family, such as Canidae, that includes coyotes, jackals, foxes, and wolves, those are all 4 different species. They look quite different. It took 50 to 10 million years, all right? So a very long time for those differences in that family to evolve. However, the differences that we see across different breeds in dogs has only taken 10,000 years to occur, that humans have been doing this for about 10,000 years. So obviously, artificial selection is very strong, right? We are choosing who gets to mate and whatnot. And so if we can have this much of an impact on appearance and function and behavior of dog species within such a short time frame, it is easier to understand that natural selection over a longer period of time could do the same thing. Let's talk about the fossil record and how it demonstrates the existence of intermediate species. So first of all, how do we determine the age of fossils? So scientists use something called isotopic dating. You may have heard of carbon dating. And this is looking at carbon isotopes that are present in the bone of fossils, right? And so we have, for example, for carbon, here's 3 different isotypes, 14, 13, and 12. And carbon, the isotope of carbon changes over a long period of time. So for example, we have carbon 14. So the number is based on, or the isotope is based on the number of protons and neutrons. So 6 plus 8 gives us 14. And over time, carbon 14 is going to lose a neutron and become carbon 13. 6 protons and 7 neutrons gives us 13, and so forth to carbon 12. And scientists know exactly how long it takes. They have estimates of how long it takes for carbon 14 to convert to carbon 13 and so forth. So again, isotopes, this is based on the number of neutrons and protons, and one element can have multiple isotopes, right? These elements, these isotopes are unstable and they are breaking apart, right? And so they use something called the half-life, which is the time it takes for 1/2 of the atoms in that sample to decay from one isotope type to another. For example, the half-life of carbon is 5,700 years. I'm thinking that's supposed to say 57,000 years. And for potassium is 1.25 billion years. So if they're looking at something that they estimate to be super old, they might use potassium. If it's something like a fossil that they estimate to be a bit younger, they'll use carbon. And in this graph, we can see on the y-axis the proportion of parent isotope remaining. So for example, in carbon, that would be carbon 14. And then we've got time and half-lives on the y-axis. So scientists know, for example, how long it takes, how many half-lives, how long it takes to get to 1 half-life, to 2, to 3, and 4, and that can be used to date out these different fossils. So they look to see, all right, how many isotopes, what proportion of isotopes in this fossil is carbon 14 versus carbon 13, and then they can get an estimate on the age of that fossil. So scientists now have a method for aging fossils. All right, they can kind of predict a time range in which that organism lived. And now we're trying to find these gaps. All right, so if the idea is that, for example, that snakes came from lizards, we should be able to find a species that looks kind of like a snake and kind of like a lizard, right? So the ability of fossils to form is actually quite rare, and so it has been hard to find these transition or intermediate forms, but there actually are more than I even originally thought. So one example, the very popular one, is Archaeopteryx, which is looks like a transition species between bird and dinosaur. Right? So can see, for example, in this fossil that we have some species of traits that are similar to that of birds and some traits that are similar to that of dinosaurs. So we have wings, which would be reminiscent of birds. However, teeth, if you look closely at this slide, in the beak of that dinosaur, it has teeth, which is more reminiscent of dinosaurs. So it's not necessarily that they may have an intermediate trait. So for example, like only half of its mouth is full of teeth, or maybe they're only tiny teeth, but it's more that they would have a mixture of traits of one. Some parts of the body may appear more like the original ancestral species, and other parts may look more like what they eventually evolve into. And so we've got a few different examples, other examples of these transitional fossils. We have a four-legged aquatic mammal, which is thought, this fossil is thought to represent a link between land-dwelling hoofed mammals, ancestors, and current whales and dolphins. Also, we have an example of snakes evolving from lizards, in that there is a fossil of a snake with legs. Another example, in oysters, there's great representation of intermediate species. Over time, oysters evolved from having small curved shells to large flat shells. And over 12 million years, they have collected a variety of fossils that show the shells getting flatter and flatter over time. Let's look at this example that we talked about with the evolution of whales and dolphins from land-dwelling hoofed ancestors. So on the top we have our modern whale, right? And then we have an example intermediate species that has 4 legs, right? But it is still, the 2 back legs are not really used too much in walking or swimming. So this organism, while it has some traits of its ancestor, such as the 4 limbs, it also has traits of the whale or dolphin in that it is a swimming animal. Another example we have on the top here, Ambulocetus natans. This one probably walked on land, so it has 4 legs, and it is able to walk in this example compared to the other. And probably not super fast though, right? Not super flexible. It still has a pretty long tail. And then lastly, we have this species that's thought to be kind of the ancestral species of whales and dolphins. It's got the 4 legs. And what's interesting is when you look at that skull of this Pakicetus attacki, this is what's thought to give rise to our modern day whales and dolphins. Even though modern day whales and dolphins don't have these hind legs, they don't have 4 limbs, the skull has remained quite similar over time. And so if you go back and forth between these 2 slides, you'll see that the skull has not changed very much at all. Let's talk about how we think of evolution, right? So a common misconception is to think that evolution is like a chain, and that one is evolving into another, into another, into another. But in fact, it's more like branched, like. All right. So let's look at an example of horse evolution, all right? So this is a good example in which you could think that evolution occurred in a chain-like manner because we really have just one family of horses, Equidae, right? So these are the ones that you think of, right? They run really fast, they like to live in grasslands, they have long legs, right? However, the first horse, ancestral species, was quite small with short legs and was adapted for wooded habitats. And what happened is over time, the environment changed, right? So we talked about how in natural selection, the traits that are beneficial, that get selected for, are dependent upon the environment. So things that used to be really beneficial for being in a wooded habitat, over time, as the environment changed to be more grassland, they weren't as helpful anymore. So things such as change in size, the shape of the foot, and as well as teeth, right? Adapted to be more effective for a grassland environment. Now what I want you to notice when you look at this is that it's not a chain, right? We see a branched pattern, However, only this final last genus, Equus, at the very end, that's the only one that is currently still surviving. So at one point during the Miocene era, there were, I think, about almost around 20 different genera, right? You can see we've got, I don't even know how you say some of these, right? Hypohippus, and we've got Parahippus and Mercyhippus, right? And it's just that the only ones that we see now is just this Equus at the very end there. So first of all, I want to emphasize that branching pattern. And second, again, we have changes occurring in foot shape and in teeth. Right? So let's look at, and also body size. So we can see that the body size is getting larger. Imagine you're an animal and you're trying to survive in a wooded environment, right? As you're running from prey, you need to be nimble, right? You need to be able to run around through trees and bushes and make tight turns. So being really big, not helpful. Having big feet, or actually having lots of toes, that's going to be beneficial so that you can grip and turn and have a lot of maneuverability, right? So when you look at the modern day horse, what happened is actually over time, the horse originally had 3 toes and 4 toes, sorry, dropped down to a single toe, right? And so also the things that that animal is eating in a wooded environment is going to be different than in a grassland, right? So if you're eating grasses, you're going to have kind of like flatter teeth that have a larger surface area but ridges in it to help grind up grass, versus a different shape that you can see in our oldest species, maybe a little more pointier to be able to eat things like leaves and branches. Great, so let's look at this example, and of course my face is in the way, but I also have posted these slides without the video that you can take a look at on your own. So we see this trend over time, right, of the body size getting larger and larger. But we have one exception. This Nanopus has a decreased body size, right? So I'd like you to take a minute and to think, right, when we talk about natural selection, what are the 3 conditions that must be met? And what do you think is happening that's causing a decrease in body size? So first of all, the first condition is phenotypic variability. There has to be variability in size. So in that population at that time, there was probably some slightly larger and some slightly smaller horses, right? Horse body size is something that is quite variable across all sorts of different species. And the environment has to select one of those traits to be advantageous, right? So we talked about over time, as the environment changed to become grassland, they didn't need to be small, they didn't need to have that quick maneuverability to turn really quick and hide, and so they evolved to have larger size, they can run faster and longer, right? A predator is going to see them from far off, and so they need to be ready to run. And they need to be able to run for a long time and fast. And then the last thing was that that trait had to have a genetic component, right? So we can see that genes for body size are being passed down amongst over time. So we know there is a genetic component to body size. So what do you think is happening, right, with this Nanopus genera? So we talked about that second condition, that the traits that are selected for are which is beneficial and which aren't is dependent upon the environment. So if the environment changes, so then will the traits of that species. And so it's likely that this specific environment that Nanopus family was found in was maybe not quite so wide open plains and grassland. Maybe there was a period of time where the area they lived became more forested, right? So a change in the environment can change what traits are selected for in a population. Let's talk about some more evidence for evolution, including homologous structures, embryonic development, and imperfect structures. So when we say homologous structures, what we mean is that two very different species, when you look at their skeleton, they have actually some common characteristics. So the structures appear very similar, but they have quite different functions. And one of the easiest structures to look at is the forelimb in mammals. So let's look at a variety of different mammal species, from human to horse. And then you can see that these forelimbs, they have a variety of different functions, right? Bat is flying, porpoise is swimming, horse is running on the ground. And so even though they have quite a variety of structures, there's some very common things, right? You've got some type of um, radius ulna type bone in yellow, and then you have some type of finger-like type bone, carpals, metacarpals, things like that. Remember, we talked about the evolution of the horse over time. It originally had multiple toes, and we lost them down to only one. Let's look next at embryonic development. So when scientists look at different species and how they develop, they find some very similar traits, right? So whether it's an organism that's a fish or a human, they actually look quite similar during development. Like, okay, great, they look the same, but why does that matter, right? So what they've found is that a lot of the instructions, the templates, the patterns that are being followed for development are quite similar across species. And then as that individual, as that organism develops and becomes older and older, the traits that make it more unique start to appear. So they're all using kind of the same common body plan or template to start out the development of an individual. And so an example that we see is these pharyngeal pouches in vertebrate embryos. They are going to the embryos, whether it's going to become a fish or a human, they have these pharyngeal pouches. And so it's just this temporary structure that they look the same at that point. And as they grow, those pharyngeal pouches develop into glands and ducts in humans. And in fish, they develop into gill slits, right? So the body plan, the template during development is the same. And as those different species grow and mature, their unique traits start to appear. The third example that we have is this idea of imperfect adaptation, right? So because evolution and natural selection is just kind of making good with what is available, it's not always going to be necessarily the best design, right? So if I was to, for example, make a human eye, I probably wouldn't design it in the way that it currently is. And we'll talk about what I mean by that in a minute. So the first example I want to talk about is neck vertebrae. All right, so animals that have really long necks, the more vertebrae they have, the more flexible they are. All right, so geese have 25 vertebrae in their neck. Pliosaurs, those dinosaurs with super long necks, have 76. Mammals have 7, right? Most mammals don't have super long necks. One exception is the giraffe, right? So even though the giraffe has a super long neck, it only has 7 vertebrae, right? You've seen videos of giraffes trying to get a drink of water, right? They gotta kind of get all awkward looking to bend their head down because they have only 7 vertebrae. There's only so many angles at which their neck can bend. And you think, oh, that's not beneficial, right? If I was going to make a giraffe, I would put in, I don't know, 50 vertebrae. But let's think about natural selection in those 3 conditions. First of all, there has to be phenotypic variability, right? In mammals, all mammals, whether you're a giraffe or a mouse or a cat, they all have 7 vertebrae. 7 vertebrae. It doesn't change. So it's not like there's some individuals within an ancestral giraffe population that had 8 vertebrae and some that had 6, and so they selected for, a certain number. The only option was 7. So if there's no options to choose from, if there's only one option to choose from, you can't have one trait be better than another because there's only one trait, right? So that first condition for natural selection isn't met, and so the neck of the giraffe has not evolved to have more vertebrae. Even though that is not a perfect adaptation, that's what has happened. Let's talk more about that example of the eye in vertebrates. So I don't expect you to memorize the structure of the retina. You're welcome to, that's what I research. But here we're looking at a vertebrate eye on the left and a mollusk, so an invertebrate eye on the right. And when we look at the back of the eye, we have the retina, and so that's the light comes in and hits the back of the eye where the neurons are that receive those signals. And so you can see in figure A that there is an arrow showing where light is coming from. And in fact, the photoreceptor cells, those are the cells that take the light and turn it into an electrical signal, are way at the back of the retina. And not only that, they are facing away from the light, so they're in the wrong direction, right? So it doesn't make sense that an eye would be designed that way. Now, different evolutionary path in invertebrates, we can see that they do have where the light is coming in, it is first hitting the photoreceptor cells and they're hitting in the right direction, right? So for some reason during evolution of vertebrates, again, natural selection is just making good with what is available, and so it's doing its best, but it's not perfect, right? Let's talk about vestigial structures. That is another example that's kind of similar to that of the imperfect structures. This idea that as one species is changing over time, it's acquiring certain traits and losing others, right? And sometimes we see in species they have organs or structures that don't seem to have any function. And the thought is that these are left over from previous species that evolved from, right, a common ancestor, and in that ancestral species, it was important. But it's not anymore, but it's not necessarily hurting the current species, and so it's not going away, right? It doesn't have a benefit, it doesn't have a disadvantage, so it just kind of hangs out. So an example, some humans, some people can wiggle their ears. There's no purpose. Maybe there's some of you out there that find it very attractive, I don't know. But in general, there's no purpose. It's not giving us any survival advantage, reproductive advantage, but we still have it. Whereas in other species, other animals, moving your ears is an essential method of communication, right? If you have a dog, you know what I'm talking about. Another example of a vestigial structure can be seen in boa constrictors. So boa constrictors have hip bones and rudimentary hind legs. Again, they are not walking, they have no function, but they are still there, giving evidence that these snakes may have come from lizards at one point. Another example can be seen in cavefish. So the cavefish species are thought to have, so they have eyes, but they're not functional, so they can't see. They are living in these dark caves where they can't see anything, so there's no point in having eyes, right? And so the eyes aren't functional, but it's not hurting them to have the structure there. Their ancestors that lived in areas with light needed the eyes, so those were evolved. But they're not beneficial and they're not harmful, so they're just leftovers. Here we have a picture of a whale with a pelvic bone, right? So we said that whales are thought to have evolved from hoofed, four-legged land dwellers. And even, they only have 2 limbs. However, they do still have the pelvic bone remaining, indicative that at one point an ancestor had hind legs. All right, so which rule of natural selection explains why the giraffe neck is not perfectly adapted? Why does the giraffe neck only have 7 vertebrae when it in fact would be much better if it had, say, 50? Right? Think about those 3 conditions. Which one explains why this is not the case? Let's talk about our last objective, this idea called convergent evolution, in that the same patterns and traits can evolve separately in completely different areas at the same time. So biogeography is the study of species, how they are distributed geographically, right? Is there any patterns that are found? How do species evolve in different locations around the Earth? And so scientists have found that very distantly related species found in very distant locations sometimes look remarkably similar, right? And so it appears that there's certain traits that are just have this natural advantage that tend to be selected for, no matter where that individual is found, or that species is found. Again, this is called convergent evolution. So it's thought that you have 2 distantly related species. They're on opposite ends of the world, for example, but the environments that they are in are quite similar, right? Our second condition of natural selection is that the environments are what shape which traits are advantageous and which ones aren't. And so even though these do not have a recent common ancestor, they're not closely related, they look very similar. And when you look at the environments where they grew up, even though they're far away, they actually look quite the same. And a great example of this can be seen when you compare marsupial and placental mammals. So these are 2 major groups of mammals, marsupials and placental mammals. Marsupial, that would be things with pouches, right, like a kangaroo. And marsupials are pretty much exclusively found in Australia, right? So we can compare in this very distinct location, are there any common features that evolved separately that we also see in other locations that have these placental mammals? So this chart demonstrates multiple examples of convergent evolution. Again, the Australian marsupials evolved separately, very far away from the placental mammals. Yet you find very similar features in burrowers, anteaters, right? They look similar, but they're not closely related. Climbers, gliders, right? And again, all the ones on the top are placental, all the ones on the bottom are marsupials. The ones on the bottom are restricted, specifically found in Australia, and so they're geographically very separate from those placental mammals. But for whatever reason, for example, the environment in which the anteaters evolved, whether they were in Australia or in North America, they were quite similar, and so they evolved very similar traits to make the most of their environment. Another example, if you think about marine life, right? Swimming through water, there's certain traits that are just going to be beneficial, right? So it doesn't matter whether this fish or aquatic organism is found near the North Pole or in the Caribbean. Having certain traits are just going to be common. Certain traits are just going to be commonly found because it makes sense, such as having a streamlined body shape. Right? So sharks, tunas, the non-existent now ichthyosaurs, right, and dolphins all have this common shape. They all evolved separately the same feature of the streamlined body shape. So you can see this also when you look in examples from Darwin's work. So you've got these in the Galapagos Islands. Again, these islands are being formed by volcanoes. And so there wasn't an island there, and now there is one, and there's not much on it, right? And so what happens is you've got this new island, and say a plant or an animal, bird for example, goes out onto that new island, right? And so this new island now has a different environment than the mainland, right? So that new pioneer species is going to adapt to that specific environment. It can access resources that maybe it didn't have access to back on the mainland, right? And you might find that several new islands popped up, and they all were like this, right? They were all relatively uninhabited. And so we've talked about this before, right? You can find that sometimes that these species look more similar to each other from the different islands than if you compare the species on the islands versus from the mainland. Now we're going to watch a video in lab this week, though there's going to be one about lizard anoles that I really want you to pay close attention to because they talk about convergent evolution in that video. And so it's a great example to help you understand this topic in more detail. So a little more about Darwin's thoughts, right? These islands, they were never connected to the mainland. He's thinking, all right, they arose from volcanoes, and the only way that species could get there was by floating or flying or swimming. And so a lot of this convergent evolution is seen in those types of animals, right? And again, they have adapted to an entirely new environment, so they're going to look very different from their ancestral species on the mainland. However, if there's another island that's similar to theirs, right, to theirs, they're actually going to appear and have a lot of the same traits, very similar to another island species compared to one on the mainland. So let's do another problem. Two species of birds evolved separately in two different locations, right? And they underwent convergent evolution. So despite their differences as ancestors, they now appear and behave quite similar. Right? Think about what could be some traits that could be evolved in parallel among both birds. So when you think about this, let's consider this idea of convergent evolution. We said it's dependent upon that second condition, that the environment is selecting what traits are beneficial. So maybe you had two bird species that were very different in, let's say, beak size, all right? One had a very short, stubby beak, and another had a really long, pointed beak, right? And so then they underwent convergent evolution, so they are two completely different places, right? But let's say that in both islands, the only seeds that are both locations, the resource that is available are large seeds, right? We talked about how the species is going to adapt to its environment. And so in this case, we've talked before about having large beak is going to give you an advantage in eating larger seeds. And so even though these have evolved separately on their own, if there's features that are similar in their environments, they're going to have phenotypic or behavioral features that are similar. They evolved separately, but just both happen to evolve the same trait of having a bigger, longer beak. And that's just one example. I encourage you to think about others, right? And use those in your quiz. And again, you can't use this example that I gave, but this is an open-ended question, and so I just want you to try. There is not necessarily only one right answer to this quiz question.